Hi, everybody. So nice to see you. Happy summer. It's hot outside. Oh my God, it's not even like hot Southern California. It's like Southern United States hot. I didn't know that Southern California has humidity, but it's been like 100 degrees and 90% humidity. This is, I spent my middle school years, late childhood, in Georgia, in Marietta, Georgia, and I have very fond memories of those years. Namely, that there were thunderstorms, and so as we were kids, we lived in neighborhoods. They have neighborhoods; they're called subdivisions, and they have pools that are kind of communal, and they have tennis courts. So the kids would go to the pool, but because the weather was so humid and there was so much moisture, there was often thunderstorms. So we would be in the pool all the time, and we'd have to get out of the pool till the thunderstorm passed, and it would pass, and we'd jump in the pool. And I have one just indelible experience of being given the thankless responsibility of mowing the lawn when I was, I guess, 13 years old. And it was in the middle of the summer, and when humidity is up in the 90%, you're trying to mow the lawn, and what happens is it's so moist that you literally cannot push the lawnmower. And I remember being able to do one row of, and we were blessed, we had a half acre, because there's no, who wants to live in Georgia, right? There's a half acre of grass, and I remember having to do like one thing. I think I got through 2 rows, and it was just unbearable. So Southern California is giving me some kind of flashbacks of that. So I'm glad that you're here. It's really nice to spend the summer with you. How many of you were not here on Tuesday night to see the movie? We're not here Tuesday. Everybody was here to see the movie on Tuesday night? Fantastic. Okay. So first of all, we're a nice, intimate group. It's nice to see you. We're a nice, intimate group. So just take a moment, take a look around. If you don't know the people near you, say hello, introduce yourself. We're going to spend a few minutes learning together. If you're comfortable, come sit closer. I imagine that there'll be like 10 more people coming before we're done. I'm blessed to know all of your names. That's so great. So I hope that you all know each other. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Okay. So welcome. The movie we saw on Tuesday night was called Salak Shabati. And I'm so appreciative that you saw the movie, even if it's not the first time that you've seen it, but that it has been shown in our community, because I think that this film is a cornerstone of our modern understanding of Jewish life in Israel, and in particular, the formation and relationships between the emergent Jewish life of Israel, the Israeli society, and how we as North American Jews, diaspora Jews, see Israeli life. And while the filmmaker, Ephraim Kishon, is an Israeli, he's an immigrant and still very much carries of that generation the experience of growing up in a different country and trying to accommodate and assimilate this emerging social experience that is to be known as Israeli society. So we're going to just study that tonight. And the way that I like to study it is, first I want to introduce us to who Salak Shabati is. And I thought I would speak a little bit about who Salak Shabati is and point out a couple of the critical features that I think we need to pay attention in his performance, and what I think that the filmmaker was trying to convey. And then I think that we should point out a few interesting insights that each of the scenes brings up, which will bring us to the large conversation of the filmmaker's vision of Israeli society. This movie was created in 1964. So it is not even 20 years since the formation of the State of Israel. And it is certainly before the Six-Day War. And there is a dramatic change in Israeli society that is going to take place after the Six-Day War. So in many respects, what we are witnessing is kind of the formulation, it's the fermentation of what is the ideal society in Israel, what it ought to be, the humor or the satire in portraying what it is, and the conflict about how to resolve what it ought to be and what it is in the eyes of the filmmaker. So after we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about who Ephraim Kishon is, because it's important to share a little bit about his story, and I think he has some interesting things. And we're going to learn a little bit about something else that he wrote, which is a great text, and then we'll conclude. And then I don't envision this taking too long, and I very much would love to engage us in conversation, because I think the biggest question that we should ask about all these movies is, what do we learn from this? What is it that we're going to take away from watching Salach Shabati? It's a fun movie. It was kind of long because it was made in the 1960s. So, our concept of what is entertainment is slightly different now. And our patience, our tolerance for a story, the elongation of a story is different than it was. So if you felt yourself getting a little tired towards the end of the movie, you're not alone. So what do we learn from it? That's what we're going to say. You already have something to say. I want you to hold on to that. I can't wait. I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Welcome, David. Okay. Salach Shabati is a play on words. Salach Shabati is clearly the name of a character, which sounds Middle Eastern, sounds Eastern or Oriental. The character is either a Moroccan immigrant or he is a Yemenite immigrant. It is not certain who he is. If you look from the perspective of Ephraim Kishon, he identifies Salach Shabati as being Moroccan. But it is very clear that a lot of the personality traits are very similar to other Oriental Jews and, I think, citizens of the Middle East at that particular time in history. So you could say, not Sephardic. Yeah, Sephardic is, we have misappropriated the word Sephardic in our community. He's really Mizrahi, which means Eastern. Sephardic is the name that comes from Sfarad, and Sfarad is the word for Spain. So those are southwestern Europeans. This is really North African at best, Moroccan, Tunisian, Libyan, Egyptian, and Yemenite, Iraqi, Iran, those Jews. Iran to a lesser extent, because our Persian Jews are, we call our Persian Jews Sephardic, but they're not Sephardic at all. Absolutely. Yeah. Exactly. So she said, yes, if Moroccans, you could call them Moroccan Sephardic, because most of the Jews who emigrated from Spain and Portugal emigrated to Morocco, because it's just across the Strait of Gibraltar. It's a very simple travel. And often, and since the time of the expulsion, from Spain in the late 15th century, and beginning of the 16th century, those Jews fled to Italy, and they fled to Morocco. Most notably, the Rambam Maimonides was one who was kind of in the court in Spain and then was forced to flee and went to Morocco and later Egypt. So that's a little bit of the story. It doesn't matter where Salach Shabati came from. It's clear that he is not an Israeli. And it's even more clear that he is not an Ashkenazi. He is not a European. He is not a Polish Jew. He is not of that dignified, refined, sophisticated European mindset that the Jews from Europe brought to the land of Israel in the 20s, 30s, and even in the 50s when the land was being settled. So that's... I will get to that. That's great. So if I may, let me just give a little bit of that. Hold on to that, and then can I address that later? So Salach Shabati, as much as it's just a name that sounds like it's a guy from Morocco or Iraq or Yemen, is also a play on words. It could also mean Salicha Shebati, which means in Hebrew, I regret that I came. In other words, Salach Shabati, from the very outset, before you even see the movie, is a story about characters that have come from rich cultures. The Jewish communities of Yemen and of Morocco and of Iraq are rich, deep-rooted communities. Whether their social mores are complementary to the Ashkenazic way of life and the early formation of Israeli society, that is playing itself out in the movie. And the play on the name, Slicha Shabati, is twofold. It's one, an apology for the Moroccan family that came to Israel, and look what happens to him. He doesn't get the house that he's promised. He goes to live in the tent camp. He doesn't have any real profession, so he makes up a profession, but he can't get that job. He gets put in to do all kinds of other work that he has virtually no qualification to do, and he certainly can't make enough money to live. He has all of these cultural practices which are not consistent with the modern way of life. And he is going to come into conflict with those. And in fact, that's going to play itself out in the course of the movie. And one of the pinnacle scenes, which you remember from the movie, which is at that end with the chicken coop, where Salach Shabati is talking to the kibbutznikim, who are representing the finest and the most important ideals of the early formation of the state of Israel. He pleads with them that his way of life is something precious and that he's being told to give it up. Slicha Shabati, you're asking me to give up something. And also, Israeli society is saying the same thing. You know, we have this ideal that the Jews of the world, the dispersed of the world, are going to come into Israel. Well, guess what happened in the 1950s? 250,000 Jews came from all over the world and they had no place to live. So where did they get put? In those things called ma'abarot, which means transit camps. And the one that we saw in the movie, that was nice. You know what was interesting? 2 women came up to me after the movie. I'm sorry that they're not here because one woman was apologetic. She had another commitment this Thursday night. But she wanted to tell me that she grew up in one of these transit camps early in Israel. Her family came from China. She eventually emigrated to South Africa, but she ended up from China to come to Israel in the 1950s to live in one of these ma'abarot. And she said, I think that was her expression, which if you know what the word means, it tells you such a rich dictionary filled of definition about how terrible it was. So, Slicha Shabati, the story is about how 250,000 people emigrate to the country within a matter of a couple years and have a very difficult time assimilating. Not only physically, they have no place to live, but culturally, there's all kinds of conflict. So who's my friend Salach Shabati? Who is this guy? Who is he that we want to say maybe we're remorseful that he came? So first of all, the irony is he is intensely moral. He's intensely moral. You would question that because he's playing the backgammon game and it looks like he's taking the money from the Ashkenazi and he's telling him, why you don't know how to play the game of backgammon, and he's not really telling the interior minister the truth when he says that he's a shoemaker. So he has a couple things that are a little bit on the line. But then you have one of the best scenes of the movie, which I think we'll come back to again and again and again. And I hope for those of you that are learning with me, the forest scene. By far, one of the most memorable scenes of this movie is that forest scene when he is given the task early on in his experience of making Aliyah to Israel to go work as a forestry worker, volunteer, whatever he is, in the JNF forest nearby his transit camp. And what are they supposed to do? Simply plant trees. And what happens? Really of no consequence to him. A man comes, sets up a ladder, takes a very nice poster, hammers the poster into the ground, And then along comes a taxi cab, and out come the people, the Berenbaums. You should have remembered the Berenbaums because in the very first scene of the movie, when they're walking down the steps from the airplane, guess who comes out and she says to the man, Chaim, I think she calls him Chaim, right? You forgot your camera, right? Which is a wonderful statement about tourists. Their name is Chaim, but they don't speak a bit of Hebrew. And they have all of their American affects. She walks down the steps with her fur coat, and he's walking around with his camera. So the scene begins with the taxi cab arriving, and out come the Berenbaums, and he's trying to take the picture of Salah Shabati. And what is he doing? He's very, very embarrassed. He doesn't want his picture to be taken, so he's hiding from the cameraman, turns his back, and the man is frustrated and walks away. And then they leave. And what happens? This is the best. The poster comes down, and up comes the next poster for the Zilbershines. And in come the Zilbershines. And if you remember, they were also the people that came down the steps from the airplane in the first scene. You remember the man that was very anxious about his bags? That was the man that came out of the car with his wife, twirling around, and all of a sudden he was relaxed. And the same thing, welcome to your forest, says the man. And Salah Shabati sees this, and he feels that a crime has been committed. So what does he do? He starts pulling up the trees, and he starts taking them away. And the man says, what are you doing? And he says, this is not this man's forest, it's that man's forest. That's what you said. And the man immediately, working for the JNF, does what to Salah Shabati? You're fired! And what does Salah Shabati do? Baruch Hashem, may God be praised. And he drops the trees and he walks on. Now, that's one example. It's clear that throughout the other parts of the movie, there are all these moments, like, for example, when he is arguing with the interior minister and he wants what he wants, and guess what? He comes out and he tells his family back to the transit camp. In fact, every time that he comes out to tell his family back to the transit camp, it's because his moral compass is directing him back there. That happens when he tries to go get the place and he's told that he needs 1,000 lira. It happens when he goes to the chicken coop and he makes the deal with the kibbutznikim. And then guess what happens? Once he has the money and he finds out his son wants to marry the kibbutznik daughter and he gives her the money and he says, back to the Ma'abarot. And what happens for, poor moral Salah Shabati in that moment? It's a wonderful play. He gets back to the Ma'abarot, ready to live there. And after he makes his protest, the housing minister has the police throw him into the truck and say, you don't get to decide when you get to live in a house. I'm going to make you live in a house. And off he goes, and the moral man gets his just desserts. Salah Shabati is a moral man. You know what? He's also prayerful. And there's a few scenes, if you've watched the movie, and I had the privilege of watching it before we watched it, so in my second watching, I was paying close attention to when the camera focused in. And the moment in which the camera really focuses in on Topol, or Salah Shabati in that moment, is when it's raining outside. And remember, he's miserable. And he's calling for his daughter, and he says, give me the money, and the wife is crying. All you do is drink. You're a drunkard. You're a drunkard. And he leaves the house in a fit of frustration, and he stumbles and he falls, and then what happens? He cries out to God. He's crying out to God, and if you were able to catch it, God, why are you doing this to me? Why? You promised me, this is the land in which you promised me, and this is what I have. I'm living in a hovel. Please, God, answer my prayers. And if you paid it close attention, because Kishon is doing this on purpose, what happens? The camera pans up, and what do you see? The poster for the elections. Salah Shabati has something. We'll come back to the elections in a minute. He's prayerful. He's prayerful at that. And you know when else he's prayerful? He was prayerful when he was playing backgammon. Yeah? Don't forget that. What does he do? He takes the dice, he shakes it, he holds on to it, he puts it to his head, he holds it on the side, he's doing this thing. Why is he doing all these things? He's praying. What is he praying for in that moment? He's praying to get a good role. So Salah Shabati represents a very interesting religious personality. He's a man in despair, and he's a man that is wishful for something that has nothing for which he can control. It's totally beyond his control. He prays for God to intervene when he lacks control, and he prays for God to give him good fortune. You know, there's one other scene. I'll stop and I'll take a question. There's one other scene, the synagogue scene. You remember the synagogue scene? The synagogue scene is great because he walks out of the synagogue. The rabbi walks out with the talit on his head. And the other men walk out, and out comes Salah Shabati, and what is it? He's got the backgammon box, and he's stuffed it behind his back in his pants so that the rabbi doesn't see that he's been playing backgammon during prayers. And then what does he do? He says, "Thank you, God. Thank you, Rabbi, for such a wonderful, moving prayer experience." He's a very interesting prayer personality. And it's really opening up, what does it mean to be a religious personality from these immigrants who are coming from a different land? Let me stop. I'm talking for a minute. Go ahead and make some comments, and then I want to outline a couple other personalities. Oh, thank you.
He doesn't really, he prays to God, but he doesn't need God's help because unless he's being divinely inspired, because you notice that everything that he did to manipulate everybody around him to come up with what he needed at the end was all done by him. So if you're thinking that God provided this, it's him that provided it to himself, whether he realized it or not.
It's a beautiful part of his religious personality and it's very characteristic of that cultural influence.
And I'll show you
the feeling,
another
please.
Example too. When the woman who's very officious comes to him to sort of help him get settled and everything, you notice she changes from an official person to almost like a little girl and he becomes the father. That whole thing changes. And, of course, I didn't realize this before, but this is what's going on throughout the whole movie. People are changing because of what he does, his influence.
That's a beautiful comment, and it is a great segue to the next part of Salah's personality, because that's not necessarily about his religious personality, it's about his emotional intelligence. We'll come back to that. Any other comments at the moment? We'll just take a pause. Michael, you okay? I stopped you for a moment. David, you got something to say? I would love to hear it.
I wrote down quite a few things when I got home. Let me go over one of them here. So being a filmmaker and taking film classes and doing all this stuff with film, I kind of approached it from a cinematographer's point of view. So one of the things I noticed at the very beginning was when they were all walking down the tarmac, that the camera was set at a very high angle, looking down at Salah Shabati and his family. Now, most people would think, oh, that's a nice shot, but it was done for a reason. It wasn't because they didn't have anything better to do, and it wasn't because they wanted a really nice, cool-looking wide shot. It was because in cinematic language, having the camera set up that high is a sign of insignificance. When you think about it, wasn't Salah Shabati and his family treated as insignificant individuals?
You know what, David? I love your comments,
Yeah.
and I want to hear the things that you have to say, but I want us to stay on topic about where we are. So if was there anything particular to the subject where we're at right now? And then otherwise, what we'll do is I would like to do a little presentation, if you don't mind.
Oh, okay.
And then afterwards, why don't we share what our thoughts are and what we could take?
Oh, okay.
Thank you. What a great point, and it's a really important point about when we get to the end of what are we going to learn from this? What is it trying to say? So thank you. Okay, are we good? All right. So he's surprised by the capability of women, and Don really picked it up. Really picked it up. Because what is it? What's going on? First of all, what's the blatant obvious one? He's afraid of the dog. He has his 2 sons. He tells the daughter, "No, you can't go. This is not a place for a woman to be." And then and he sends her away. They don't catch the dog because he eats the sausage because he's a no good Nick. And then they're walking away in utter defeat. And guess who walks up with the dog like nothing? Mazel the daughter. How beautiful is that, right? He is amazed by it. He's amazed by it. He also is amazed at the kibbutz administrator who is talking to him. Not just, first of all, he like dismisses her because she's got short hair, she's gruff, she represents everything that, at least at that period in history, does not typify the role that women ought to have. And so Salah Shabati is actually completely disregards every aspect of her identity because she's simply a woman. And then you begin to hear her plea or plaintive cry to say, "Mr. Shabati, this is the 20th century. We listen to women, and I'm going to tell you why. And you're going to listen to me." And Salah Shabati listens to her. And the humor is that he's going to eventually manipulate her. But he does so with there's a sincerity. And then there's the young woman who is going to first help the poor Transit camp residents. And she comes in with her papers. She's all disheveled. She drops her papers. And in a moment, what happens? She begins to shift from being the official trying to take in information to the child who just needs a loving parent. The young woman who has devoted her life to the kibbutz lives in a room with 3 other women, later 4 other women, is missing a positive father figure and finds it in Salah Shabati. And what does he do? He totally disregards women in every place, and yet he has this like amazing emotional intelligence to like see into the heart of this woman. And it's by seeing into the heart of her that not only does she transform and become not only compliant but also sympathetic to him, but he actually softens and he's very loving to her. It's actually one of the nicest relationships in the entire movie. Better than the relationship with his daughter. We don't really know about the relationship with his wife. We clearly see how he thinks about his youngest daughter. And yet here's this relationship with a woman that a person who verbally says, "I don't talk to women. Women are to be sold for a negotiated price, a dowry." This is a woman that he says to her, he says, "Anytime you want to come live with us, you can come live with us." What's going on there? It's a really nice point that you brought up. He's changing. So not only is he a person that represents this model of the Eastern Oriental Jew, the Moroccan Jew who's coming with his primitive and antiquated social practices into the sophisticated and modern, evolving Israeli society. But he is a man that changes, but he doesn't change to conform to Israeli society. He changes to conform to the people that he relates to. Kishon is trying to reveal something about, not about like what is a society, but what does it mean for these people who are dispersed throughout the world to come to live together? And Salah Shabati all of a sudden becomes king, right? He's the kingpin. He's the guy who knows in the cafe how to rouse a whole group of men to dance and sing this ancient Arabic song about a Messiah that's going to come and bring 7 children, lots and lots of girls, and finally a son. And when the Messiah will come when the son is born, and he'll give the son a name. So the last 2 points about this emotional intelligence is that the ability to negotiate with the kibbutzniks, just like playing the backgammon game, is something like characteristic of this culture. And it's brought up in the most sharp and pointed instance when Salah Shabati goes to the house in Ramat Gan in Tel Aviv to return Pucci. What's Pucci? A little white dog. And what's the dog that he brings? Jeremiah, which is a big black dog. And they say, Pucci's white. And Salah Shabati, if you didn't catch it, says, what? What's the difference between black and white? This is in 1964. You know what's happening in the world at this time? Martin Luther King is giving his best speech, one of the finest speeches ever recorded in humanity, about the dignity of every human being. And Salah Shabati, this like primitive, Eastern, Oriental Jew with no education, he doesn't even know how to read, is touching his finger on the most pressing social issue of his time. That is telling us something quite profound about who Salah Shabati is. That's the character of Salah Shabati. He's this rugged, rough, poorly spoken, definitely a paternalistic and a patronizing human being, diminishes other people, takes advantage of people's weaknesses. Right? He says in the house when he's miserable, he's with his kid, he says, we're suffering, but when I'm going to be a big man, when I'll be a shoemaker and the new person comes to me, I'm going to make them suffer just like we did, because you may have old shoes, but you're new. Wow, what a personality. Okay, are we okay so far? So, yes.
I had a problem with the dogs.
Yeah.
I mean, you do that with the dog.
You have a problem with the dog. You have a problem with Pucci.
I didn't get to Martin Luther King part, but if I wanted a white, if my dog was white, I was very unhappy with him bringing me that other ugly dog. So I didn't think that was so moral.
Yeah, you know what's interesting about that scene is that the Israelis, who clearly embody this sort of sophisticated Tel Avivian, European, cultured Jew that is really a worldly Jew, and they love their dog, and he's this Middle Easterner who has a reticence to dogs because they're not domesticated. That dog is a member of the family. So we would be upset like them, but what are they? They're afraid of him. They can't appreciate him because his demeanor is so foreign to them. I agree. They should be completely angry, and they are. They don't give him the money, and they say, it's not good, and then he runs out and he says, leave the dog. So, yeah, maybe we could say he's got a morally ambiguous character. I'm willing to leave that. Cease. Okay.
I really thought that he was an irresponsible husband and father. He takes the kids, he sends his kids out to work, and then he takes their money to go drink and play backgammon. He does, when he goes to carry that big bookcase, he's like bargaining, and then he gets close and he stops. It's like, I got you now, so I'm going to try and get more money. And you see later in the movie, he just left it, which is like so incredibly irresponsible. If you take the job, finish the job.
Yeah.
So, I know that I'm steeped in the Protestant ethic, but, and that's, I'm sure, a lot of why he drives me up the wall. I just wanted to shake him. I don't see him as a moral guy. I see him as a guy who's just trying to cheat everybody.
Yeah, I think what we learn about him, and as is kind of the cultural milieu from which a character like him emerges, is not an immoral human being, but I think we can say he has moral ambiguity and very much toes the moral line. And I think our sensibility would be that line that he is towing is completely immoral. And I think that he and of his culture would say, look, I'm playing by the rules of the game right up to the point where I'm about to break the rules. And being cognizant of what the limit is and pushing right up to the limit, that's something that we as North Americans and Europeans, we're not very comfortable with. And that is something that I think we can bristle with. But I'm willing to accept, and I don't want you to walk away thinking that I think that but personally I think that Salah Shabati is an exemplary model of moral character. On the contrary, I think the filmmaker is trying to lift him up to say that there is something in his character, in his being, that has a value in this developing Israeli society. And it's something that I think is really going to play itself out when we talk a little bit further about Israeli society, because the society itself is going to have conflict with that. It's not going to really know. That's why the cab driver, for example, says, I know your customs, and that's why I'm going to offer you this dowry. I think I love your daughter, and I'm going to offer you this money, right? And they negotiate for her. Right? That's because he respects the cultural milieu of Salah Shabati and is willing to engage in him and not dismiss him and say, this is, ridiculous. It's why the kibbutzniks do the same thing as well. Actually, the message could be that when the kibbutzniks are also the ones that negotiate with him, that they are compromising their moral character. And this is an argument, this could be an argument about the failing moral basis of the kibbutz itself, which Kishon has something to deal with. When I'll get to a little bit, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But Kishon lived on a kibbutz for a while, and it's clear that he's kind of reacting to that way of life as that becomes a model. Just a couple of scenes, yes, very quickly.
Several comments. Salah Shabati is not clearly Moroccan and is not clearly Yemenite, and the pajamas is Iraqi. The way the Iraqis used to walk around the pajamas. I was a new immigrant. I was in a transition camp, and we were Ashkenazi, and we came, from the DP camps. And we were for a very short time until they placed us in abandoned Arab houses in Akko. But then I went to nursing school. In 1956, there was a mass immigration from Iraq, from Morocco. I went to nursing school in Afula. Afula is near Beit She'an, near Nazareth, near Nahalal, there I was. So they used to send us, the students, to Beit She'an. And in Beit She'an, they brought a whole slew, like they bring in the Ethiopians now, or they did. They brought from the Atlas Mountains.
If you can bring your question or comment, please.
And the scene with the faucet, it's very true. These people didn't know how to use toilets. We used to get babies with dysentery because they didn't know how to use refrigerators. So that primitivism is true, but there was a very rich religious cultural culture that they brought with them. Mm-hmm. And we are looking at them now and saying he's not moral, he is moral. We're looking with Western eyes, with Ashkenazi Western eyes, with the Yekes, the Putzi owners. But they brought a very religious culture that was in a way suppressed.
Yeah,
this is what Ephraim Kishon is bringing.
Very nice point. And just to sort of re-articulate it, when we're watching the movie, as much as we want to say, boy, look at how primitive these people are, there's a richness to the culture that has an impact on Israeli society. And that tension is being played out in the movie. And the example of them being surprised by running water is beautiful, because immediately preceding that moment, what does the family do before they enter into the apartment? They all take off their shoes. And they take off their shoes because it's a sign of sanctity. So they knew that they were walking into, and that kind of cultural expression is something that enriches Israeli society. It's not about taking your shoes off. It's about creating sanctity in the space that you find. So a little bit it has like some superstition, but a lot of it has to do as well with the culture that has been blended into Israeli society.
TV show showed the smart Moroccans and the Ashkenazis are the ones, the cultured, so-called cultured, are the stupid one. And this movie too, he's the smart one, and he outwits all the Ashkenazis that he's dealing with.
Yeah, interesting, right? As much as that there's a moral compass that I think we're moving towards, the tension of this is that this guy doesn't have our morality, and yet he gets by his manipulations. I mean, he fails at his manipulations until the end when he finally realizes, he says, you always get what you don't want. So what does he do? He goes and he says, we don't want those houses. And guess what? It's the one thing that ends up to be true in the movie. It's the most pivotal moment. When finally all else fails, he can't do any scheming except to say that he wants or he doesn't want what he really wants. Yeah.
I just want to know why they don't incorporate the transit people into the kibbutz.
So, great question. So and a wonderful transition to the next of the last 2 points about the movie. So, why don't they just incorporate him into the kibbutz movement? So what happens to these transit camps? The transit camp period is actually a very finite time in Israeli history. It depends on how you count the time. You say it's either between 1951 and 1959, 10 years, okay? Or till 1963. There's some camps. What happens to these camps? Well, some of them are struck down and they cease to exist because all of the residents are assimilated into the larger society. The other one is actually these transit towns become cities. They become cities. In fact, the cities become places that we know, like Kiryat Shmona, which is one of the northernmost cities in the state of Israel. That was a transit camp. The city of Sderot, which is near the Gaza Strip and has been the subject in recent years of tremendous conflict with the missiles constantly falling into Sderot. That was at one point a transit camp, as was the city Beit She'an, if that's what you're talking about. Well, that's where you went to school. As is Yokneam, which is also in the center of the country, or Yehuda and Migdal HaEmek. They're also sort of in those mid-northern cities, which later become really nice cities, actually. They're very nice cities. Beit She'an, is a wonderful middle-class town in the middle of Israel. Kiryat Shmona is pretty much a middle-class town, but some of these other places are kind of nice. They're kind of nice. They've evolved to be, special cities as part of the state of Israel. So these transit camps were very brief in their construction. And we have to sort of pay attention to that because the movie is trying to identify something that the rest of Israeli society wants to forget about. If you hadn't watched Salach Shabati, you would be hard-pressed to find a whole lot of information about the Ma'abarot. In fact, when I did some of my own research in preparation for sharing our discussion tonight, and you type into Google the word Ma'abarot, guess what comes up? A place called Kibbutz Ma'abarot, which has nothing to do with the transit camps and has everything to do with the kibbutz that's still in existence. You have to get to page 2 because there's something about Israeli society that's embarrassed and ashamed of what happened there. Because this mass immigration, which is really the fulfillment of thousands of years of vision of returning the exiled and dispersed Jews throughout all the lands, is actually it's an administrative problem. It's a personnel issue. It is a social problem. There were too many people that came in, and like I said before, 250,000 people were living in transit camps. 250,000 people were living in transit camps. We could talk about the challenging issues today of homelessness. We could talk about in this country there's right on Burbank Boulevard there are these places that are just really problematic to our society. Imagine 250,000. Okay, the city of Los Angeles is pretty serious. We're talking about 50,000. That is not an insignificant number. 250,000 people lived in these camps within the period of time. And Israeli society wants to wish that it never happened. And in fact, without this movie, we wouldn't know what impact that experience had on the life of so many people. And you could talk to me about it. You grew up in it, right? You could share. Ask your Israeli friends about what transit camps were like. So that's an important thing. Yeah, that's right. So the point was that, while the rest of Israeli society was slowly modernizing with electricity and television and running water, these transit camps had the most basic of necessities. And just another addition, and then I'll take Carol. The Jews from Eastern Europe who were in displacement camps were their records of Israeli society saying that those people did not deserve to live in those in transit camps because the standards were even worse than the displacement camps that they had been living in Europe. That's how severe this story is. The place that we see Salah Shabati in, that was a palace. It's hard to believe that because it looked like a hovel. Those camps didn't look like that. They looked like what real camps look like. They were tents. They were tent cities. That was what they had. The idea that they were like shacks, that's a dream, Carol.
Didn't that movie take place in 1949?
The movie's supposed to take place in the 1950s.
Oh, I thought it said 49.
No. Yeah.
When Egypt kicked out all the Jews, Iraq kicked out all the Jews, and they brought the Jews from Morocco. That was in the 50s, 56. And the movie was made in 64, but what it depicts, I think, is the late 50s. Because by 64, I don't know how many Ma'abarot were left.
According to most historical narratives, they were not. No. It was a period of 10 years of Israeli history. So what had happened is the infrastructure of Israeli society had finally caught up to the massive influx of Jews from around the world, and it took 10 years for them to accommodate that. So it didn't mean that a family spent 10 years in the camps, but it was certainly possible that the Ashkenazi guy who said that he had been in the camp for several years is no mistake. That's a point. So two short last points. One is about the elections, which is a really great point. Yes, it's a sort of a distraction, but it's like one of those great scenes that you can't forget because it's just like the trees being picked up. So what happens, right? He's trying to get some money so that he can get to a house, right? He cries out to God, God, how are we going to live in this house? And the scene pans up, and there it is saying elections. And he talked to his friend, and he said, they give you gifts. And the next scene is all about the gifts that Salah Shabati is going to get, including the house. So I just wanted to say a couple things about how is that possible. So Israel is it's a representative democracy. Basically, elections happen on proportional representation, meaning that you can have as many political parties as you wish. And if you look at the modern day ticket of how many political parties, there's twice as many as there were in the movie. The idea that currently I think there's an Israeli pirate group, there's a cannabis group, there is all different kinds of political parties. There's the Nachman of Bratslav party in the last elections, and all of these people actually cast votes. In order to be elected to the Knesset, you don't just simply have to be a representative of some party, and as long as you're the representative and somebody votes for you, you get in. You have to have, according to Israeli election law, 3.25% of the total electorate in order to be elected onto the Knesset. So we know today that there's two major political parties. There's the Likud, which is currently led by Benjamin Netanyahu, and it's his leadership of that centrist right, maybe a little more right to the center than is typical of the Likud party right now. And then you have what's called the Labor, or currently it's called the Zionist Union. That was David Ben-Gurion's party, and that also occupies basically the largest portion. Between the two of them, so they only occupy about 30%. So 30% Likud and 30%, and this time it was like 25% in the last election. So, and then basically that means that another 45% of the entire electorate is made up of all of these other small parties. And so that's why you have factions of the ultra-religious party. Just out of curiosity, what do you think is the third largest political party in the Israeli Knesset? Third largest. If the Likud is currently the first largest and the Labor is the second, you could say the religious? No. Any other guesses? What's that? Shas. You have Shas, you have United Torah Judaism, you have Aguda Rabbanim. No, none of those. None of the ultra-religious parties. Are you ready for this? The Arab Israelis. The Arab Israelis occupy the third largest political party, and in the last elections, they garnered something like 20 seats in the Knesset because of their representation. So it's very interesting. And if you want to extrapolate that into some of the other issues that you've been discussing about some of the demographic issues, two-state solution and integration of Arabs into Israeli society, naturalizing Arab citizens and allowing them to become Israeli citizens, and the political conflict that's ensuing, these are the challenges that are on the table right now. It's why peace isn't so easily possible, in part. So the elections is really funny because what does Salah Shabati do in the scene? First of all, he's an illiterate. So the guy says, don't worry, all you need to know is, you know, the letters, and just, it doesn't matter who you vote for. Just tell everybody you're going to vote for them, and you get all the stuff that they promised you, and you vote for whoever you want because it's all confidential, right? So what does he do? Right? He takes a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, stuffs it into an envelope, and he tries to stuff it into the box. They're shocked because they have no idea what to do. And we're watching the chaos ensue, and what's the final moment of the scene? When the stamp says this was disqualified. So here's an interesting point. In the 1951 elections, okay, so, you know, state is founded in 48, right? There's elections. 1951, they have other elections. There are about 7,000 disqualified votes in that year. And you know how many people voted? What was the percentage of the people that voted that year? Any guesses? 87%. Okay? We talk about 30 to 40% as being a good election season in the United States. 87% that year. Which, of course, right? Something makes sense, right? Brand new country. Sure, I'm going to vote for whoever. 1955. The very next elections takes place about every 4 years. So, 1955. Any guess on how many disqualifications? 3 times the amount. 22,000 votes were disqualified. So it went from 7,000 to 22,000. Why, you might ask? Because of the primitive, illiterate, Eastern, Mizrahi, Oriental Jews, Moroccan Jews who don't know how to read and were just playing the system and didn't understand how the system was played. It's a very, very interesting tension that's unfolding that plays itself out in that scene. One last point about the scenes of the movie that just kind of help us shape what Israeli society is. The last point is that in that scene about the kibbutz, which are why didn't they incorporate into the kibbutz? Because the mentality of the Eastern Oriental Jew or the Moroccan Jew, the North African Jew, is not to participate in a collective effort. And one of the scenes, right, the guy says, well, it's his, but it's not his. And what does Salah Shabati say? Do you remember? You have a wonderful memory. What does he say? Do you remember at that moment? What he says? So he's talking to the cab driver, right? And he says, well, it's his, but it's not his. Remember, they're talking about it's in the very beginning of the movie. They're talking about the tractor. And the guy's driving the tractor, and he says, ooh, he has a big car, right? He doesn't know cars. His car is bigger than your car. He must be a very wealthy man. Well, no, it's not really his. And he says, it's not really his. And he says, wait a minute, it's not his? He says, well, it's his, but it's not his. And Salah Shabati picks up on this, and he says, do you hear yourself? Do you hear yourself? Because there is a tremendous conflict between Eastern, Western, or in this case, for us, it's Eastern, Western, East as in communism and West as in democratic principles. And who is Salah Shabati? he's neither east nor west. What is he? Right? He's neither east or west. He has to make the choice. He has to make the choice. What is his choice? His choice is to negotiate and sort of figure out whatever advantage that he can get given the situation that he is. He's not a fully democratic individual, and he's certainly not a fully communistic person. So the story is also about how does a person who is sandwiched in between these two very powerful political, social forces have impact on him. That's why he drops the bookcase right in the middle, which I think is hilarious, right? Because he just leaves it, right? And they leave it in the scene. They leave it. You know why they leave it? Because the communists don't even know what to do with it. It doesn't belong to Salah Shabati, and it doesn't really belong to the administrator of the kibbutz, and it doesn't belong to the community member. He's trying to ask his friends to help him, and they don't help him. Why don't they help him? I thought everybody was supposed to be working together. Well, somehow they don't collectively own the bookcase. So there's some tension that's unfolding there. All of this plays out into what I think is, a couple of really important points about Israeli society. Let me stop for a minute, and then we have a few minutes, and I have a couple texts that I want to share with you. One is from Ephraim Kishon. One is from the great Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. Thank you. And one is from David Ben-Gurion. Everybody's okay? Any comments? Anything that I left out? Yeah, Michael.
Getting back to the disqualification. The fact that the disqualification was written in English disqualified. Not in Hebrew.
No, it was. It was in Hebrew.
Was it?
Yeah, it did. The stamp was Hebrew.
Was it really?
Yeah, it was. Sorry, yeah. But it's a very interesting point, though. There is this, that's another tension coming.
Because, I felt there were so many stereotypical issues, stereotypical Jewish comments that were played out in this movie, and I read the Google, what was it, the Wikipedia article before I saw the movie about all of the awards and this, all of the different awards, and obviously, seen around the world. Who was the audience that this was directed?
Thank you.
And was it really truly playing out as you're suggesting as to the character of what's going on the in Israeli society?
Formation of Israeli society.
Or is it really amplifying the worldview of what a Jew is?
Fantastic question. I think I would love for us to explore that question once we get through this, because I think that's what Ephraim Kishon is also asking. And there's a couple of examples where this is brilliant. The forest example, where the Americans get out and the Israeli is like, hello, welcome to your forest, it's beautiful, welcome to Israel. He's speaking in this broken English to give him the thing. And remember in the taxi cab when Salah Shabati is trying to get back home after dropping off the dog, and guess who picks him up? The cab driver. And who's riding in the cab with him? The American girl who doesn't understand a word of English. And what happens there is that Salah Shabati and the man are speaking in Hebrew, okay? So talk about, first of all, Salah Shabati is an Israeli. He's not, even though he's East and West, he's Israeli. He gets off the plane speaking Hebrew, right? That's no mistake. It's not like he has to learn a new language. No, of course not. But then they're talking about the girl. And what does the guy say, the cab driver? He's like, why don't you marry this girl, right? And he says, you can always get what you don't want, right? And he wants Salah Shabati's daughter, right? And that's a turning point of the movie. I want to tell you about Ephraim Kishon. So Ephraim Kishon, first of all, he's born in Hungary. His name is Hoffman Ferenc, okay, like Frank Hoffman, okay, in Hungarian. How does he get to Ephraim Kishon? Well, Hoffman Ferenc was born in 1924 in Hungary. In 1944, he's 20 years old. Hungary witnesses the most devastating chapter of the Shoah, when 400 to 600,000, depending on your count, of Hungary's Jews are shipped off to the death camps. 20-year-old Hoffman Ferenc is taken to a work camp and escapes. Becomes a little bit of a part of resistance. He actually is saved in the work camp because the Nazi commander likes him because he's a good chess player. So he's a very bright individual, and just by caprice is given favor by the Nazi commander. Changes his name to Kishont. Kishont in Hungarian is just a name, like any other name, and Kish in Hungarian means small. So he comes to Israel. Yeah, little, right? Kish is a little small. Hont is, do you know any Hungarian? I don't know a little bit. I don't know what Kont is, but all right. So he's Kish Hont. So he comes to Israel. They don't have Ferenc, so they give him Ephraim. They want to give him Kishon. He wants to keep the T because he wants to keep a little bit of his former life, and they refuse to give it to him, so they name him when he gets to the country Kishon. What happens to him? There's no such thing as transit camps when he comes to the country, and he ends up in a kibbutz. And he's kibbutz in a few years. He's already a very talented satirist, writer. He's quite capable. His writing has already been recognized. It was recognized in Hungary and in Europe. He's already receiving prizes. So Ephraim Kishon begins to perceive the very rapidly changing dynamic of Israeli society and begins to write. He writes 700 books over his lifetime. It's very impressive. Wins an impressive amount of prizes, including the Golden Globe for this movie, Salach Shabati. There was actually 2. Golden Globe for being Best Foreign Film and a Golden Globe for Chaim Topol for being the Best Actor. And there's one other movie in which he receives a Golden Globe. It's called The Policeman. I don't know anything about it, but apparently it was a Golden Globe winner. And he also gets the Israeli Prize, which is the finest, most prestigious, most highly regarded and respected award given to an Israeli in one's lifetime, and he receives the Israeli Prize. So Ephraim Kishon is telling this story about the Ma'abarot because he already sees that the society wants to forget about them, and he uses it as a wonderful entry point into satire. So if you take a look at the front page, let's read what Ephraim Kishon writes in honor of one of the State of Israel's celebrations of independence, called Happy Birthday to the State of Israel. And I love this. Israel is a country so tiny that there is no room to write its name on the world map. It is the only country in the world which is financed by its taxpayers abroad. It is a country which all the time eats up its inhabitants and yet does not grow fat. It is a country of boundless boundaries. It is a country where mothers learn the mother tongue from their sons. It is a country where the fathers ate sour grapes and the children's teeth are excellent. It is a country where one writes Hebrew, reads English, and speaks Yiddish. It is a country where everybody has the right to speak his mind, but there is no law forcing anybody to listen. That sounds about right. The State of Israel. It is the most enlightened country in the region thanks to the Arabs. Da-dum-bum. Did you get that? It's the most enlightened country in the region thanks to its neighbors, the Arabs. It is a country where all the capital is concentrated in Jewish hands, and there is much grumbling because of this. It is a country where one can buy anything in the world for his money. That's not true anymore, by the way. You understand that there's huge financial investment from lots of other countries in the world today, Russians, Chinese, and Americans. Warren Buffett's even invested in the United States. Where was I? It is a country where one can buy anything in the world for his money except an apartment, which is very expensive. That's still true today. You know, it costs like $1 million to have a 1,000 square foot apartment. $1 million. It's very expensive, and it's not easy to get one. It is a country where any babe in arms may contradict his papa's political views. It is a country of elections, but no choice. It is a country which is an organic part of its trade unions. I love that. It is a country where nobody wants to work, so they build a new town in 3 days' time and go idle the rest of the week. It is a country where a slip of paper can move mountains, but all the mountains beget his speeches. It is a country which produces less than it eats, and yet of all places, it is here that nobody has ever died of hunger. That's almost true. It is a country where nobody expects miracles, but everybody takes them for granted. It is a country where one calls ministers simply Moshe and then almost dies with the excitement of it. That is a very true fact even today. We had a bunch of members of Knesset come to Valley of Shalom earlier this year, a few months ago, and these people are they were significant members of Knesset at this moment, and they all introduce themselves by their first names. It's extraordinary. We're grateful we have a congressman in our congregation as well, and if you call him Brad, it's a little uncomfortable. But you should meet him. Actually, we know his mom, so we'll tell him that he better be nice or his mom will be upset. It is the only country in the region whose political regime is the bus cooperative, meaning that like the bus drivers have more opinion about the political landscape than the members of Knesset themselves. It is a country whose survival is permanently endangered, and yet its inhabitants' ulcers are caused by the neighbors from above. It is a country where every human being is a soldier and every soldier is a human being. It is the only country in which I could live. It is my country. What a beautiful thing. So who is this man, Ephraim Kishon? Clearly, he's a man that Michael is looking from the outside in, and yet is so integral to the society. The movie is exactly that. It's what David started to say. There's a view from the outside. Look at this small Jew. These people are animals and so uncultured, and they're just, they're so rude and they're barbaric. Barbaric, he's even called, right? They're barbaric. And yet, family. Whew. They're family. They're family. Yes?
Does it mean it is a country of elections but no choice?
Yeah. So I think, I'm not exactly sure what he meant there. I think that the recent right. Yeah, you don't pick, you could say that. You could say you don't vote for an individual, you vote for a party. Okay? And so therefore the party chooses who's going to be up at the top of the list. So you could like Likud but not be Benjamin Netanyahu, but if you vote for Likud, he's going to be the prime minister if they win. The other side of this, the other side of it is also that it's like the recent wall issue in which there's an agreement made, but because of the political system, it's so tenuous and fluid, and a small group of very vocal and influential people can disrupt the whole government structure that sometimes the ability for the government to represent the needs of the people is frustrated by the political process.
Actually, you vote for a party, right? But then that party, if they don't have enough mandate, they form a coalition government with other parties which you don't like, you may not like, and they are the ones that govern, like, Likud goes with the religious party, and then they enact laws that you have no choice and you don't like them. So you vote for one party, but then you get an amalgam, you get a concentration of parties, the coalition, and you may not like what they're doing.
Right.
And by the way, where did Ephraim Kishon end his life? Where did he live in the last years of his life?
In Switzerland? How about that? No, that's an interesting point. Thank you.
So
No kidding.
why is Israel considered a democracy?
It is a democracy.
Well, that's not any kind of democracy that I know about.
It's not a Republican democracy.
We
It's
don't even have a democracy, so I would like to know.
right. It's called a proportionate. It's called a proportionate representation democracy, meaning that it's just a different way. Like you still get the vote, right? You still have a choice. It's not. It's not that there. Look, democracy says there's a process. That's not true. The democracy is a look. It's still a vote, and the people will choose. And if there's enough political pressure, even though there's elections every 4 years, political pressure can dismantle a government and force elections at any time. That's absolutely democracy. But I don't. I would love. I think perhaps we deserve. It's a very complicated lecture to understand what is the Israeli government and how it functions. That would be a really great study session. I think that you would need a PhD in logic and a legal degree in order to understand it all. But the idea that it is a democratic process is true. He's just making. I mean, this is his this is his opinion. Okay, it's not totally true.
To a fault, Israel is too pure a democracy because proportional representation, which is the system in Israel, seeks to give everybody a vote. Even a minority party has a vote.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the way things evolve, it's a curse, not a blessing.
Yeah, nice. All right, so flip the page. Flip the page. It's really complicated. It deserves another study session. Flip the page, because I think the first scene is still the most important scene. The first scene is the El Al plane lands, the doors open, and out pour the people. Some of them are making Aliyah, and some of them are tourists. Some of them are outside looking in, and some of them are going to be inside looking in and maybe even looking out. So who walks down the stairs? The Americans, the Germans, and the Iraqi, Moroccan Salah Shabbatim. Yehuda Amichai writes this poem in 1980 about tourists. And I think it's so reflective and insightful about the difference that we have as Americans watching this movie and trying to understand what Israeli society is all about, and then having Israelis kind of understand the society and also may have the privilege of American society and try to understand what it is. I think this idea of family, of belonging, of commitment and a certain allegiance, fealty to these spiritual brothers and sisters is something that is playing itself out in this film. So look at Yehuda Amichai. If you haven't read this poem, this is one of my favorites, and he's certainly such a treasure to not only Israel, but I believe to the best of literature and what we've created as people. So condolence visits is what they're here for. There is referring to tourists. Sitting around at the Holocaust Memorial, Yad Vashem, putting on a serious face at the Wailing Wall, laughing behind heavy curtains in hotel rooms. They get themselves photographed with the important dead at Rachel's tomb and Herzl's tomb and up on Ammunition Hill. They weep at the beautiful prowess of our boys, lust after our tough girls, and hang up their underwear to dry quickly in cool blue bathrooms. Those are the tourists. Once I was sitting on the steps near the gate at David's Citadel, and I put down my 2 heavy baskets beside me. A group of tourists stood there around their guide, and I became their point of reference. You see that man over there with the baskets? A little right to his head, there's an arch from the Roman period, and a little right to his head. But he's moving. He's moving. I said to myself, redemption will come only when they are told, do you see that arch over there from the Roman period? It doesn't matter. But near it, a little to the left and then down a bit, there's a man who has just bought fruit and vegetables for his family. There is a change in perspective that this movie brings us. That if you hadn't seen it before, I really hope that you take away from watching this movie and learning tonight. The Israeli society that we see on the outside is rugged, arrogant, self-centered, manipulative. It is questionably moral. It is self-serving. You see how many times Salah Shabati cut in front of line? Anybody who's been to Israel knows that there used to be people that did that. They're a little bit better now, by the way. If you look at the Israeli society only for its warts, then you'll miss the richness that I think the movie's trying to bring out. This man has a piety and a devotion and a commitment and a sense of family, and he wants to name his kid Ben Gurion. It's not just for show. It's because they land on the plane and they walk more than the tourists. What do? The tourists walk down. And what does Salah Shabati do? Shechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Our lives are a blessing. May not be easy. Actually, it's pretty miserable for him. But his life is a blessing. One more text just to leave you with a little bit about David Ben Gurion. Then we'll open it up for comments. I know you have much to say, and then we'll call it a night. Israel's economic and cultural progress is due to three things: the pioneering spirit that inspires the best of our immigrant and Israeli youth, who respond to the challenge of our desolate areas and the ingathering of the exiles, the feeling of diaspora Jewry that they are partners in the enterprise of Israel's resurgence in the ancient homeland of the Jewish people, and the power of science and technology which Israel unceasingly, and not without success, tries to enhance. Take it just one step further. What is the beginning of this society? Sure, it's about the emotional profile of characters that are weak and very easy to criticize. But what the culture is trying to build is something strong and vibrant and enduring. And what is it going to be? The words of David Ben Gurion. Responding to the challenge of the most neglected places of the land. Being partners with the world and making the ancient homeland of the Jewish people come to life. And the power of progress, which Israel, as a people, is constantly trying to achieve. And at the end of the movie, I really have that sense of hope, as I hope you did too. So what do you think? What are we supposed to learn from this movie? That's a little bit about what I learned. How about you? What would you like to take away?
When I saw the movie when it first came out, and I was a very young woman then, and I was living in Israel, and the attitude of it's funny, it's nice, this is our life, this is reality, right? Then I saw it later on, and then I saw it now, and I find myself being angry. This time when I watched it, I was angry. I said it depicts, everybody is stupid and everybody is immoral and everybody in not such a nice. And then when I came out, I said, no, I shouldn't be angry anymore. But the difference, in the 60s, the naivete of the movie. Am I pronouncing it correctly? How naive it was. Everybody is two-dimensional. Everybody is either very stupid, smart, but very naive movie. I mean, the kibbutznik is falling in love with a girl who just came, probably doesn't even speak Hebrew. And Gila Almagor, she's falling in love with that man who are primitive. It's very naive, but it's very sweet. But looking at it with now eyes, you become very cynical about the whole movie, and that's my attitude. It's nice, but it's so dated.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. This is definitely not the last movie you should watch about Israel society. Do you want to say something? You okay? Okay, good. Thank you. Good point.
Oh, is it me? Well, you know, one thing I noticed, I know a lot of people thought that Shelah was a manipulative, good-for-nothing, low-life character, but he really wasn't. You know, he was promised this, he was promised that, and the government just didn't want to deliver, right? He was a desperate man, and I think he was just doing things out of desperation. Sometimes we do stupid things, you know, but he was promised a house, and he was going to get that house, and he was going to do whatever he could to get that house, short of maybe killing somebody. But, you know, he was just trying to make a comfortable life for his family. I don't blame him. I mean, if I ended up in a place like that, I think I would probably try to do something desperate myself to get a better place. But he was just trying to eke out a living. I can't blame him for doing some of the things that he did.
Yeah, thank you. Really nice point. That I think we should walk away. You know, we have to. It inspires us to watch the movie more than once, because we're gonna see, and that's what makes it, I think, a good movie, is that you watch it with a few different perspectives. And I hope, you know, you'll be a little bit more forgiving, like Dave is this time. Maybe sometimes you'll be frustrated because it really is a very negative depiction of the character and makeup of Israeli society back then, and even a little bit now.
One thing I was curious about is that they didn't mention at all was why he left where he came from. What were his issues and what was he expecting when he came there?
Well, that's a great point. So what happened? Either they were kicked out, or they were part of a mass effort by the state of Israel to bring the brothers and sisters who are in peril in different parts of the world. So even, and we have done that. And so the magic carpet emigration, which is happening around that time from Yemen, and later the Ethiopian emigration and the Russian emigration, all of these big movements in which large populations of Jews from different parts of the world came, was because they were either being kicked out or they were under such oppression, political or physical oppression, that the Jewish state has established itself as being the haven for Jews throughout the world. It's it's a really important takeaway from this, is that there's always going to be a place like that now, as long as we continue to defend her. Sure.
Sorry. These people came to Israel after the state was established. But before the state was established, we from the DP camps, the Mossad at that time, same thing. That was illegal. We walked all over Europe from camp to camp to camp, and then they brought us to Israel before the state illegally, and then after the state legally. But that was two things. First of all, they were kicked out. After the state was established, all the Arab countries kicked out their Jews and confiscated, by the way, their property. Okay, so if you're talking refugees, there were 600,000 not Middle Eastern, Mizrahim, Oriental refugees that came to Israel, and they had nothing, so they had to put them in those camps. That's one thing. So when they came after, that was an organized effort by the Israeli government to bring the Moroccan, the Iraqi, the Egyptian, all of them, bring them to Israel and try to establish them there.
Yeah, nice point, thanks. Any other last comments? Alan, please.
I thought that the movie was a takeoff of Fiddler on the Roof. And what's particularly interesting is Topol plays in Fiddler on the Roof. And when I first saw the movie,
I thought he was not Topol, I thought he was Herschel Bernardi, who was the original portrayer of Tevye. And I think the theme was very similar. The daughters trying to find a good match and all of that. But the difference is, Fiddler on the Roof was a fantastic job. This, to me, was a Class B movie, all the way.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And it gets 2 Rotten Tomatoes for Alan in the back. Thank you. So, no, it's a perfect place to leave it because you'll now have Fiddler on the Roof to watch in 3 weeks' time. So you'll have to remember that we have 3 more movies ahead of us. They are shown in the synagogue on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m., and the study sessions and the lectures will follow on Thursdays at 7:30 p.m., except for Fiddler on the Roof, because it is a 3-hour movie. It will begin at 6:30 p.m. on the Tuesday evening that it will be shown. So thank you for coming to learn with us, and I'm glad that you spent the time exploring it, and thank you studying it with me and for sharing your points of view, and I hope that we can continue to learn Salach Shabbati. I promise you the JNF scene will be one of those unforgettable moments in all of cinematic history for you, as it has been for me over the years. You're going to see an example again and again and again of how that shows up in our world today. Have a great evening, everybody.